Jerusalem, the Contested City. Lecture 11, Piety and Polemic, the Age of Pilgrimage.
I ended the last lecture by noting that the Franciscans, this religious order of monks from Europe, had gotten back into Jerusalem. They were the thin edge of the wedge of Latin clergy returning and of European influence generally coming back into the city. That they were permitted by the Sultan, by the rulers of Jerusalem, to re-enter the city and to take up residence there. And then, from the Christian point of view, what the Pope did was to grant the Franciscans a kind of monopoly over the Holy Land, to use a much later term. They were the ones who were going to be responsible for the guidance of pilgrimage, and also responsible for the safety and well-being of whatever Western pilgrims showed up. And the Western pilgrims continued to show up, all in the post-Crusader period. Even though hostility was clearly mounting on the part of the local population, the residue of the Crusades was considerable in the Middle East. It still exists there among the Arab and the Muslim population, who still recall the Crusades, not happily. Well, feelings frequently ran high among the population, but it didn't inhibit pilgrimage. Eventually, pilgrimage began to taper off, as we'll see, but more for other reasons. The lack of safety in the Mediterranean, for example, making that sea voyage across a sea controlled by the Turks. But all that's somewhat later development. During this period, the end of the Mamluk period, all through the 14th, 15th century, pilgrims continue to come from the West. Western Christian pilgrims come to Jerusalem. Well, it is possible to see in these people who come a development of a new type of visitor, a new type of pilgrim. A pilgrim is someone who comes for a pious purpose. And by and large, the purposes that people were coming for during this era were still pious, and so they were still essentially pilgrims. But their eyes were a lot wider open than some of their predecessors. This is the beginning of the age of humanism in Europe. We're coming out of the Middle Ages and passing into the Renaissance, and the people who are arriving, the new pilgrims, reflect this change of scene in Europe. And there are more people who've gone to university. There are people who are now interested in other things than just the performance of certain ritual duties at holy places. They're opening their eyes and they're looking around. They're looking around themselves, and there's a kind of self-consciousness that one can see in pilgrim writings. They're now aware of each other and aware of themselves. They're looking at themselves. This is the beginning of the age of self-portraiture in Europe, and it's that same self-consciousness you can see among the pilgrims. And the prize example, of course, is a man by the name of Felix Fabri, who dies in 1502. Felix Fabri was a Dominican, one of these mendicant orders from Europe, and he was German. He was from Ulm, and he had been to university. He had been educated in university, and so he had a rather full education. And he has left behind him a very detailed, very full, and very self-conscious, very entertaining and illuminating account of his pilgrimage, which he made in Jerusalem in 1480. So he was there toward the end of the Mamluk period, and he was there at the same time, roughly the same time, that Mujir ad-Din was writing. If you recall from the last time, Mujir ad-Din was this Mamluk historian who left a very detailed description of the buildings of his native city. So what we have in the case of Felix Fabri and Mujir ad-Din in some cases are two descriptions of the same building at the same time, from the same era, and we can compare the perceptions. One, a Dominican Christian monk from Germany, and the other, a local Jerusalemite, a Muslim, a historian, and the chief justice of the city. By the way, just in passing, Felix Fabri's pilgrimage account was turned into an extraordinarily interesting novel called Friar Felix at Large by F.M. Prescott, and it is very much worth reading and taking a look at, or at least taking a look at. Felix Fabri supplies a lot of the details, he and his contemporaries, that give us a portrait of life in Jerusalem, and particularly pilgrim experience in Jerusalem, which has really no parallel up to this point. And as I explained last time, the first person that they encountered, the pilgrims encountered, was generally either the Franciscan superior, the custodian of the Holy Land, as he was called, or else one of his representatives. Pilgrims generally arrived by boat at Jaffa. They took passage somewhere in Europe, usually somewhere in Italy, and landed in Jaffa, and that's when they were greeted by the Father Superior, or the custodian of the Holy Land, the Franciscan. And one of his duties was to read them, I guess we would call it the Riot Act, how to behave in the Holy Land and how to behave during their stay there. And one of the things that he pointed out to them was the rather obvious fact that they one day, God willing, would be leaving. They'd be going home, but the Franciscans would be staying behind. And so any ill conduct on their part, any sort of problems that they caused, it would be the Franciscans who would be held hostage for this sort of thing. So they were warned to be very careful. And being very careful meant taking particular care of dealing with Muslims. So it was a kind of introduction into dealing with Muslims. And the general advice was go very slow and be very careful. And be careful not to offend the feelings of the local people. Don't touch them. Don't touch their beards, for example. Don't make jokes with them. Don't laugh in their presence because they think you're laughing at them. And then some very difficult advice: don't haggle over prices. All right, that just pay what they want and consider yourself lucky. Watch out for Muslim graveyards and tombs. Don't step on graves. And be careful of the ladies. Be very careful of the ladies, because frequently, if there's a lady in the doorway, there is a gentleman behind her. And so be aware, be warned, and behave yourself. Right? Just try to act in a decorous fashion. And because, as they said, you're going home, we're going to stay here. So the pilgrim took the road generally with a Muslim porter. The Muslim provided the transportation, whether it was a donkey to carry the luggage or to carry the pilgrim, depending on how much money you brought with you. You had a Muslim guide, and a Muslim accompanied you, and this was very important, because these guides, who were your translators and your helpers, in many cases they saved the lives of these pilgrims, where if the pilgrim did do something stupid and offend the Muslim population of some place, frequently it was this guide who intervened and got you out of there. So many of the pilgrims speak very highly of their Muslim guides. I think for their part, the guides had a lot of experience with Westerners. They knew how to deal with these people who looked like they had come from and sounded like they had come from another planet. So the guides were very important in shepherding them through there, and particularly if they were taking the long route. There were a variety of ways of doing this thing. You generally arrived, as I say, by sea was the normal way. You arrived in time for Easter. That was the point. That was the time when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was open. These holy places were not open at all times. And what you were going there really was to go to visit the tomb of Jesus. And that was open only a specific time during Holy Week, as I shall point out. And so you had to sort of time your trip that you'd get there. Now, when you go home, you can retrace your steps back to Jaffa and get on a boat and simply return. But many pilgrims did sort of the grand tour. They visited Damascus, some of them. They continued down through the Negev, and some even crossed Sinai. They visited Mount Sinai. They visited the biblical sites that were pointed on Sinai, and ended up in Egypt, where they visited the sites identified as the place where the Holy Family stayed. Jesus, his mother, and Joseph stayed in places shown in Cairo, and then the pilgrim would then return to Europe from Alexandria, would take boat in Alexandria. So that was the more extended way. And having a guide across Sinai, of course, was absolutely necessary. These pilgrims were not on their own. Just for their own safety, they were not on their own, and simply as a pragmatic matter. At any rate, the logistics were sometimes mind-boggling. The pilgrim, as I say, had to bring cash with them. This is an age before checks or credit cards or any way of negotiating commercial transactions without money. And They didn't bring paper money, they had to bring gold. They had to bring something that was acceptable as a form of commerce to the locals, and so gold and silver coins, which meant that the pilgrims arrived with some money, with some cash. And the local population knew this, which was part of the danger of the thing, that pilgrims, by definition, there are two kinds of pilgrims. There are pilgrims who come ready for the journey, that is to say, the ones who bring cash, and the ones who trust in God's providence entirely and bring nothing, and hope that God will provide along the way. And it's up to the local populations to distinguish between the two of them, because there's no point wasting any time on the latter group, those who trust entirely to God. And you see there's the difference in religion, that these people, the locals, didn't care that these people were making Christian pilgrimage very much. It must be said, however, that the rapaciousness of some of the locals was not a matter of religious discrimination, that they pulled exactly the same tricks on Muslims passing through on their way to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. So that sometimes the Bedouin, the people, the nomads who frequented the less populated areas in Palestine, were no respecter of religion. They didn't care if you were Muslim or Christian. All they cared about was if you had money with you. So the pilgrim on the road had to proceed very carefully, had to negotiate lodging and food. The food was odd to him or her. It all had to be dealt with in one way or the other. And they had lots of direction in terms of guidebooks and things, because many people had gone before them, and they knew their way around. The pilgrims knew what they wanted to see, generally speaking. There were some minor places, of course, that they were not aware of, which had to be pointed out to them. So they proceeded on their way, hopefully to Jerusalem. And one sort of very common reaction to the place was that pilgrims had expected to see a different kind of place. They had fed themselves on the biblical characterization of the Holy Land as a land flowing with milk and honey. And whatever else Palestine was, in that era, it certainly wasn't a land flowing with milk and honey. And Jerusalem also sort of startled people in its size. Mark Twain, when he arrived there in the middle of the 19th century, was startled by the size of Jerusalem. It was all very small. These people who had come from large European cities were kind of puzzled at the size of the old city of Jerusalem, or even passing through a place like Damascus or Beirut, which would be much larger. Jerusalem was a small place and a disappointing place in many ways. The one thing about lifting your eyes and looking around you is that you see other things, and you see a city which strikes most visitors as a very poor and a somewhat desolate place. Another aspect of pilgrimage is the whole business of relics, that all of this territory, all of this land, was holy land, and even the stones were holy. So rare was the pilgrim who just did not bend down and pick up a few stones from the Holy Land and bring them home. That's that's relics and souvenirs 101. There's a lot more advanced courses in this particular mode of education. What you really want to get hold of, these pilgrims, was something intimately connected with one of these sacred sites, and not just a little stone or pebble, something that had some sort of significance to it. And so there is the whole business of relics. Relic is literally something that has been left, reliquiae or remains. These are remains of holy places or remains of events that took place in holy places, or remains of a holy person. Now we're talking about really serious stuff. The relics of the holy person himself or herself. The chief relic of Jerusalem was, as I've already described on a couple of occasions, it was the cross upon which Jesus had been crucified. That the cross was buried in the general redoing of Jerusalem by the Emperor Hadrian, and Constantine and his mother rediscovered the cross, as the story is told, and the cross then was installed in a kind of box inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was kept at the site of the crucifixion. It was taken off by the Persians we saw in the 7th century, brought back by the Byzantines, and restored to the church, where it remained. It remained in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it was brought out occasionally at Easter or Good Friday, the anniversary of Jesus' death. It was carried into battle by the Crusaders, and then it was taken back to Europe. When the Crusaders left Jerusalem, when they were allowed to leave in 1187 by Salahuddin, they carried the relics of the cross back with them, which then became disseminated across Europe. There had been other relics in Jerusalem, very important ones, that Constantine himself had taken. That when Constantine enshrined the city, one of the things he helped himself to were any sort of mementos of the life of Jesus, or the nails from his cross, etc., things of that nature, were carried by Constantine back to his new capital, to Constantinople. And so there was a treasury house there of relics of the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. They disappeared in the year 1204. When 1204, the Crusaders took Constantinople. These are mostly Venetians, right, who took the city. They then carried these relics back to Venice, where a great many of them ended up. So today, a lot of the most famous relics of Christendom are hidden away in the treasure room of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, by way of Constantinople and originally from Palestine. But there was still in the place enough relics to go around, because we are assured by many of these pilgrims that the locals were manufacturing relics for the use of the pilgrims. Now, there's a line, I suppose, between relic and souvenir. But the thing about a relic, the difference between a relic and a souvenir, is the relic is felt to participate somehow in the holiness of the person or the event that it represents. It's not just a souvenir. It's not just something you look at and you get a memory of something or someone. The relic has a sort of interior sanctity to it. It has a kind of sacramental value. And so that the relic, a true relic, is an important thing. But one of the more entertaining and I guess scandalous stories were the kinds of things that was going on with one particular set of relics. One of the events of the early life of Jesus that's told in, I think it's the Gospel of Matthew, if I remember correctly, either Matthew or Luke, that Herod had heard of the birth of Messiah in Bethlehem. And when he was frustrated in his ability to find this child, he ordered that all infants, male infants, of the age of 2 and younger, be killed. So, because he wanted to get rid of the Messiah. And this is the point at which Jesus and his family went off to Egypt, and so they escaped this. But according to, as the tradition began to develop, the tradition of the Holy Innocents, as they were called, that 10,000 of these children had been killed in the vicinity of Bethlehem. And, of course, the body of each of these tots constituted a relic. And so the prize relic to bring back from the Holy Land, of course, would be an entire cadaver of a saint, right? And these kiddies were due, right? There were 10,000 of them supposedly in circulation. We know, right, from witnesses that the Sultan of Egypt had commanded that every child born stillbirth or infant death in Cairo was to be brought to him. The child was embalmed, and the Sultan did a lusty business in selling remains of the Holy Innocents. This is an extraordinary version, example of this thing, but this was going on. Today, as we'll see later, the relic business is not. There's a general skepticism about relics, but the souvenir business is still one of the leading industries in Jerusalem. And at this point, we can see the transition from the relic to the souvenir, right? Just as we can see eventually the transition from the pilgrim to the traveler and to the tourist. Right? It's an attitude. It's the same people, but it's what's coming over in their heads and their hearts that is the difference. The climax of the journey was, of course, the visit to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This Holy Sepulchre was not the same one as we've seen built by Constantine. This was the one that had been destroyed by Al-Hakim in the year 1009, and then rebuilt in 1048 by the Byzantine emperor. So it was about maybe 1/3 the size of Constantine's church. It also didn't open on the main street of Jerusalem anymore the way Constantine's did. It now opened, there was a side entrance that the Crusaders had built and put a belfry next to it, a bell tower next to it. So it was a small church, and anybody who enters the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from that day to this remarks and almost immediately of how small the interior is. That is to say, you walk in and you turn your eyes to the left, and there is the tomb of Jesus. And you turn your eyes to the right, and there, also right in front of you, is the site of Golgotha. That these things are within literally a stone's throw of each other. So the church is a rather small affair, particularly the central part of the church, the place where the tomb is and the place where the site of the crucifixion is. At any rate, the pilgrim had to arrive there during Easter time, and arrived on and tried to enter the church on a Thursday when it was opened. And the thing about the entry of this thing was supervised very closely by the Muslims. And one of the annoying things to Christians when they came there was a fee that was charged for entry. That wasn't annoying because the Christians had to get over the fact they were going to be fees all over the place. Every time they turned around, there was a fee, including on the roads, traveling on the roads. There were private toll collectors, right? If it passed through your property or near your farm, you go out and collect a toll from anybody who was passing. This was the business of the Holy Land. This is how the locals lived. And it was the pilgrim who had to pay these things. So there was a fee to get into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But the annoying thing was the Muslims would just sit there outside and sort of look you over like bouncers at a nightclub with a velvet chain, a velvet rope, and decide who would get in and who wouldn't. Can you imagine traveling all the way from Norway or someplace to go to Jerusalem, and then some fellow sitting outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre puffing on his nargileh saying, "I don't think so. I don't like your looks, or you're not dressed properly," or whatever the reason, if even a reason was given. This was a great irritant to the pilgrims. Anyway, once they were in, they were locked in. You were in the church from Thursday until Sunday. Right? On Easter, the doors would be opened and you could come out. And we have description again from Felix Fabry of what it was like inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for those couple of days. And he said the pilgrims, when they first entered the church, they were filled with a kind of awe and sense of this is one of the great experiences of their lives, as indeed it was. And by the second day, the awe had vanished, and now they had turned to simply curious. They were poking around the church, looking in this corner or that corner, and exploring and trying to pass the time. By the third day, he said, people were really sort of on edge. They had taken to selling things to each other. The little market was opened up. There was people were drinking, and there was all sorts of rowdiness and a lot of vandalism. One of the things that the custodian of the Holy Land warned the pilgrims about when they got off the boat was vandalism, their vandalism. Because, again, to go back to the relics, the temptation was very strong to break off a piece of something. And inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of course, you were at the heart of the whole relic scene. And so there were people who, there were the graffiti artists, whose traces are still very evident inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that every pilgrim who came there felt it was his royal privilege to chisel, we're talking about stone church here, chisel his initials or his name or some little proverb into the walls of the church, and the more pretentious chiseled, or had chiseled, probably their Batman did it for them, had chiseled their coat of arms onto the walls of the church. That's really sort of a bit much. And then there was one famous pilgrim that Felix Fabry tells, whose name was Spike, because he used to come into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Apparently he did this every year, wrapped in a cloak, and under the cloak he had a hammer and a spike, and as he would bend over in profound piety over the tomb of Jesus, out would come, from under the cloak would come the spike and the hammer, and clink, a large piece of the tomb would be dislodged by this gentleman, who then put it in his pocket and piously left the church. Well, this attracted the attention not only of the Franciscans and the Greeks and the Armenians and all the other groups inside the church, so that they would pick fights with the Franciscans over this. These fights inevitably got to the Muslim authorities outside, and so there was hell to pay in these cases, and so vandalism was not particularly appreciated, and it went on all over the city that this kind of thing occurred, of people trying to get hold of some piece of the Holy Land. One favorite thing was water from the Jordan, and the way that was done was either you could take it in a little flask, and we have preserved flasks which were manufactured in Jerusalem precisely for that purpose, to bring back some water from the Jordan. As even today, you can bring back, for very different purposes, you can bring back the great cosmetic mud from the Dead Sea, which is really vile stuff in a little jar. But then you can bring the water from the Jordan, not that the Jordan has that much water to spare Another thing that the pilgrims noted was the smallness of this. Going down to the Jordan, by the way, people love to go down to the Jordan, obviously, and immerse themselves, go to the site of Jesus' baptism and immerse themselves in the Jordan. The only trouble with that, one of the troubles with that, is it used to be the sport of the Bedouin on the other bank just to loft arrows over and see if they could plunk one of the pilgrims down in the water. It was part of their entertainment. So life there was difficult, but to get back to the water of the Jordan, one very common thing was to buy a shroud in Jerusalem and a winding cloth for your burial, and to immerse it, to impregnate it with Jordan water, and then bring it back, and then when you died, you'd be buried in the shroud which had been once immersed in the Jordan. The same way that Muslim pilgrims to Mecca bought shrouds there and had it immersed in this well that sits outside the Kaaba called the Zamzam. It's exactly the same kind of idea. Among the other things that the pilgrims saw in Jerusalem, because as I say, they were now looking around them, was noticing the population of Jerusalem. We get an idea now, we begin to get ideas, fairly elaborate ideas, of what life was going on inside the city. And so you get in some of these more sophisticated accounts a kind of ethnography of the population of the city. There was, first of all, the Muslims, whom I mentioned. You pass through a Muslim population of the countryside, and probably the countryside was far more hostile to the pilgrims passing through it than were the city dwellers, who were a little bit blasé about the whole thing. The reaction to the Muslims, whom they saw close up, the Christians were mostly baffled. They had some vague idea of what all of this was about, and the accounts where they try to explain to their European readership of what it is that a Muslim does or doesn't do, or how they live, are shot through with distortions and peculiarities and a little bit of prurient interest. They love the notion of polygamy that attracted their curiosity, as you can imagine, right? Because they would imagine this Muslim gentleman in bed with 4 ladies, right? And that's enough to carry you through a couple of days of pilgrimage. And so they told about all of these customs, but there was a lot of polemic, right? A lot of argumentation in the description of the Muslims. So some of it was just simply they despised them, they condescended to the Muslims in describing them. In other cases, they were simply polemical about them. They weren't much better with the Eastern Christians. We get a pretty good idea about this Eastern Christian population of Jerusalem. And we're talking 15th century, so the city population has been pretty much restored to what it was before the Crusades, and that among the Eastern Christians, the chief groups were clearly the Greeks and the Armenians. That most of the Eastern Christians were them, and then followed by Syrian Christians and Egyptian Christians. All of these people, essentially outsiders, and who were settled in Jerusalem, like the Franciscans, settled in Jerusalem because they were the holy places, and these were the guardians of the holy places for their respective religious communities. For the Armenians back in Armenia, for the Greeks back in Greece, for the Copts back in Egypt. These were their representatives who lived permanently in the city and kept a permanent position in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The thing about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is that you couldn't leave. Right? You had to keep a permanent sort of militarily speaking, we call it a garrison. You had to have a platoon in there, a platoon of Greek Orthodox or Franciscans or of Copts on a permanent basis. And they could replace each other, they could rotate, but you always had to keep them in there because otherwise you would lose your place. Right? That if the Greeks left for a week on a vacation, all the Greeks left the church, they come back, the Franciscans would have their chapel. It's very clear. And so they had to be in the church constantly, and the church was locked. And so today you can still see above the main doors, main entry, there are windows above with ladders attached to them, because these people had to enter that way. They had to climb up and go in through the upper stories of this thing, and food was hoisted up to them. So they did duty inside the church. But we'll more to say about these Eastern Christians at a later lecture. And then finally, they were the Jews. The Jews don't get much attention from the part of the Christian Western visitors to Jerusalem, these pilgrims of the 15th century, mostly because either the Europeans knew about Jews and didn't find it worth commenting on them. They had a fixed opinion about Jews, and so there was no need of going into that, or because, equally likely, the Jews kept a very low profile in Jerusalem. A Christian visitor, a Western Latin Christian visitor, necessarily rubbed up against those other Christians in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and necessarily ran up against Muslims at every turn of the city, but they didn't necessarily rub up against Jews. Jews lived in their own quarter and lived very quietly and very carefully in this city which they still loved. I mean, every Jew from the time of the destruction of the temple had been praying next year in Jerusalem, or may Jerusalem be speedily rebuilt. No Jew until the 19th century had the slightest dream that this could be a political reality. This was a spiritual desire that someday Jerusalem would be rebuilt, that someday all Jews would come back and return there. But this is an apocalyptic or an eschatological anticipation of the Messianic age. It certainly wasn't the prescription for a political program. So we get a good picture of Jerusalem in the 15th century, but very shortly there's going to be another change in regime in Jerusalem, and the city will embark upon a new career, and not necessarily a happy one.
This ends Lecture 11.